She was the youngest of 8 children, maybe. Somewhere else I read 2 other children. I don't know, that part is not that important. So her father was a stonemason, and the family did not have much money at all. So she went to work on a neighbor's farm. She would milk cows and herd the cattle, and she did that to bring in money for her family, and she also saved some of the money for herself. Now, it was said that she was a pretty large woman. She was at least 5'7". Somewhere I heard she was 6 foot. And she was between 210 and 250 pounds. And she looked like a strong woman. She could manage herself on the farm very well. Now, she had big dreams to move to the US and become rich. So she saved her pennies so that she could make that dream a reality. And in 1881, when she was in her early 20s, she immigrated, and she moved in with her sister and brother-in-law, who had already immigrated and were living in Chicago, Illinois. So she moved in with them. She changed her name to Belle at that time. And luckily for her, in this neighborhood where she had moved, there were lots and lots of other Scandinavian people. So she fit right in, and she was very comfortable. So she found work as a domestic servant at first, and then she got a job at a butcher shop cutting up the meat. In 1884, she married a Norwegian man by the name of Mads Ditlev Anton Sorensen, and together they opened up a candy shop. And it was not doing very well at all financially. And then, after about a year in business, it burned down. But luckily, they had insurance on it, and they collected the insurance. They bought themselves a house. And wouldn't you know it, that house burned down as well. I'm not sure exactly how many years later, but it burned down. And once again, they collected money from the insurance. Now, of course, the investigators were suspicious. How did they have 2 places that both burned down and were both insured? But they couldn't find any evidence of foul play, so they dropped the case. So Belle went on to have 4 children with Mads, and 2 of them died as infants at separate times. Both of them had acute colitis, or that is what their deaths were recorded as being from. Although what happened to them could also have happened due to poisoning, but no one suspected anything. Both of those babies were covered by life insurance, and the parents received payouts for both of them. I honestly didn't even know they had life insurance back then, but apparently they did. So, now in addition to the children that she had, she also fostered a girl named Jenny. Now, on July 30th of 1900, was saying, hey, something seems fishy. And it certainly did, because he had life insurance. Surprise, surprise. That was due to expire on July 31st. Now, he died on the 30th of July, okay? So since he knew his policy was expiring, he had already taken out a new one. The new policy was starting on July 30th. So this particular day, July 30th of 1900, that was the only day ever that he would be covered by not one, but two life insurance policies. Do you follow me? So what a coincidence that he died that day. But they couldn't find any evidence of any wrongdoing. So she got payouts from both policies. It was a total of $8,000, which was a lot, okay? In 1900, I should have looked up how much it is in today's money, but it sounds like a lot. So a year later, Belle took her money and her remaining children, and she moved to LaPorte, Indiana, where she bought a pig farm. And in 1902, she married a new man, a widower named Peter Gunness. 1 week after the wedding, while Peter was out of the house and Belle was watching his infant son, Belle was the stepmother, okay, because Peter had children from his previous marriage. His wife had died. So anyway, the infant son died while Belle was watching him, and it was said to be from a virus. Now, I don't know if this baby had any insurance. I didn't hear anything about it, and they had only been married a week, so I don't know. But anyway, the baby died, and then 8 months after that, according to Belle, Peter was reaching for something on a high shelf, and a meat grinder fell right on his head, and it crushed his skull, killing him. So, the coroner suspected murder based on her history, but they didn't have any evidence. How could they prove that it was murder? So she collected $3,000 from his death. And a few months later, she gave birth to his son. So she added another baby to her family. Now, in 1906, a few years after the death of Peter, her foster child Jenny went missing. And people were saying, hey, where's Jenny? What happened to Jenny? Because Jenny went to school. You know, the kids went to school. I believe it was a Christian or a religious school they attended, and she just disappeared. So Belle said, oh, she moved to California. She's going to school in California. And that was that. I have heard that Jenny had been going around school telling people that Belle had killed Peter. Could that be why she disappeared? I don't know. So now, without any husband to help her on the farm, Belle hired a farmhand to his family from there, saying that he was doing well. He liked her farm, and he asked them to send him seed potatoes. Now I looked that up, and a seed potato is a potato that you use to grow more potatoes with. So you plant a seed potato to grow potatoes. So when they stopped hearing back from Henry, they got concerned and they wrote to Belle. Now remember, the only thing people could do was write back and forth. So it was a little bit difficult to communicate. So they wrote to her and they said, "Hey, where's Henry?" And she answered them saying that Henry had left with horse traders and gone to Chicago. And they accepted that, I guess. What they didn't know was that she had kept his possessions. She had his stuff, his money, everything. Now another man who answered her ad was John Moe from Minnesota. He traveled to LaPorte, and he withdrew a large amount of money, and no one ever saw him again. But there was a carpenter who worked occasionally for Belle, and he would later say that he saw John's truck left behind at Belle's farm, along with more than a dozen other trucks. Interesting. So many men responded to her ads, and many men came to visit the farm. The last one was named Andrew Helgelian from South Dakota. He visited her in 1908, and he told his brother, whose name was Asle, A-S-L-E, that he'd be back in a week. But he never came back. So Asle started trying to figure out what could have happened. He went through Andrew's stuff, and he found a stack of letters written by Belle to Andrew. And she had asked him to move to LaPorte. She told him to bring money and to keep the move a secret. So he wrote to Belle to find out what had happened, and she said that she was also looking for Andrew, and that if he, Asle, would come visit, because I guess he was saying, "I'm gonna come visit and see for myself." She said, "If you come visit the farm, I will do all I can to help you." So he headed to LaPorte to look for his brother. But he would never get to actually meet Belle. Now, Belle wrote a last will and testament, and she cried that she wasn't going to live much longer. And she spoke of how her ex-farmhand was going to kill her. That farmhand I had mentioned before, his name was Ray Lampier, and he was no longer working for her at this point. So, the day after she wrote the will, her house burned down. In the ashes, they found her 3 children and a woman with no head who had all died in the fire. Presumably, Belle was the headless woman. Where was her head, though? Like, you don't just die in a fire and your head disappears, right? But everyone assumed that that was her, even though the body was much smaller than hers would have been. Now, the newspaper headline read, quote, "Fire on suspicion of arson at first, just arson. He had been seen around town wearing a fur coat that turned out to belong to Andrew Helgelien. You know, the man who disappeared, and his brother was on the way to look for him. Now, I had read somewhere else that the coat belonged to a different guy, but I don't know. When he was questioned, he admitted that he was jealous of Andrew. He stated, quote, "We got along all right before that, and she used to come to my room at night. But after Helgelien came, she had no use for me." End quote. So meanwhile, the authorities were digging in Belle's farm, the yard there, searching for the missing head. You know, they're like, her head's gotta be somewhere, like, let's look for it. But they didn't find the head. But shockingly enough, they found a bunch of dead bodies. 10 bodies, actually, were uncovered by the time that Andrew's brother, Assel Helgelien, arrived at the farm on May 3rd. So he took a look at the bodies that were found, and none of them were Andrew. But while he was there, he noticed some soft spots in the soil, and he said, hey, you know, maybe there's something there. Looks like it's been recently, you know, dug up. So the authorities dug up the spot, and they found a sack. They opened the sack, and they found pieces of someone's body. It was Andrew. Andrew Helgelien was cut up and in the sack. And there were a whole lot more spots of soft dirt. Dozens more, in fact. So they started digging all these spots up and finding more and more burlap sacks filled with body parts. In the sacks were, quote, torsos and hands, arms hacked from the shoulders down, masses of human bone wrapped in loose flesh, end quote. All the bodies had been butchered in the same way. Remember, she worked at a butcher shop, cutting up carcasses. It was a long time ago, but I guess she learned. So anyway, with all the bodies, the heads had been removed, the arms removed at the shoulders, and the legs severed at the knees. Blunt trauma and gashes were found on the skulls. It's been suggested that the reason she cut up the bodies was because they were too heavy to move in one piece. So after finding the parts of 5 bodies on the first day, and an additional 6 on the second, the police stopped counting. So things were a lot different back then. Nowadays they'd have their, computer out, sequestered, but there was no hotel to put them up in. They had to sleep on cots in the courthouse. Can you believe that? So on May 12th of 1908, Ray Lampier was put on trial for murder now, not just arson. They didn't waste much time back then. Now his attorney insisted that he was not guilty of murder because Belle Gunness wasn't dead, so how could he have murdered her? In fact, people had reported seeing her all over the place, in the Midwest, in Chicago, and it was believed that she had faked her own death because she feared being caught for all the murders that she had committed, and that the headless corpse was not her, but just another victim. But the prosecutor insisted that she was, in fact, that headless corpse, because an investigator had found a pair of gold dental bridges in the ashes, and her dentist verified that those were her teeth. That was her bridge. But then the defense came back and said, hey, she could have pulled out her bridges and tossed them so that they would be found by the investigators. It was just another part of her whole trick, you know. So at the end of the deliberations, 10 jurors found him guilty of the murder and 2 didn't. So they compromised and found him guilty of arson. And he was sentenced to a minimum of 2 years in prison. But he wound up dying the next year of tuberculosis. But supposedly before his death, he confessed that Belle had placed ads seeking male companions simply so that she could murder and then rob them. He stated that she asked him to burn down the farmhouse with her children inside, and that the headless body was actually Belle's housekeeper, and that she was planted there to mislead the investigators. He went on to say that when Belle heard that Andrew's brother, Assel, might come to visit to look for Andrew, that this had motivated her to put the plan into motion to hide all her previous crimes. In 2008, they exhumed the corpse of the headless woman, and they tested the DNA on that and tried to compare it to DNA off of a letter that Belle had written. But the sample from the paper was too old. They weren't able to compare it. So the Gunness farm has become a tourist attraction, and visitors come from all over the country to see the mass graves, and they have concession stands and they sell souvenirs. And that is the case. What are your thoughts? I will share some of mine. First of all, rest in peace to all the victims of Belle Gunness. We don't know exactly how many there were, and we don't know who they all were. But nonetheless, my heart goes out to each and every one of them for what they went through. Now, why did she do it? Was she bloodthirsty? What was the deal? Clearly, it was all about money. She just wanted money. And it did not matter what she had to do to get the money. It didn't matter these homes burning down and husbands dying and trucks being left at her place. Like, they were questioning her. And she didn't care. She's just like, give me the money and say whatever you want about me. And she was getting away with it for so long because, things were different back then. It was harder for them to get evidence, obviously. They didn't have the high-tech methods that we have now. So do I believe that she was the headless corpse? No, I don't. I mean, is it possible? Sure. Anything is possible. And the story could have changed, 100 times. Who knows? But to me, it doesn't sound like that was her body. Because where was the head? Why would she be missing a head? And have, then she wouldn't have died in the fire. Although, I guess they weren't even able to say whether the head was removed before the fire or after. But whatever, I don't think that was her. And I am extremely curious to know what sort of life she built for herself after she left LaPorte. I mean, I assume she took all that money with her. And I don't think it would have been too hard to start fresh. She could have moved to California or, anywhere on the West Coast or heading towards the West Coast. And she could have easily started anew. So I would love to know what happened, but I'm never going to find out. I doubt that I'll ever find out, I'll say. So, I am going to leave it there. Thank you so much